Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The bang of the hammer against the private property sign echoed through Douglas White's property in Briarcliff Manor, New York. Laura Thompson, with her impeccably groomed gray hair and determined smile, was hammering with surgical precision, superimposing her own sign. Flowers in Power, Sustainable Gardening Workshop Saturday, 10 a.m. Another day of victory for the community, she muttered to herself, adjusting the golden brooch in the shape of a watering can that she proudly sported on her moss-green blazer. As the neighborhood's self-proclaimed cultural promoter, Laura had turned her passion for gardening into a personal crusade against what she called territorial waste. Douglas White watched the scene from his balcony, his hands tightly gripping the old wooden railing. At 62, the former university professor had chosen Briarcliff Manor precisely for its tranquility and privacy. Now he saw his private refuge being invaded by a woman who seemed to believe that property rules were mere suggestions. Mrs. Thompson, Douglas's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. This is the fourth time this month. You've received 3 official notices. Laura turned calmly, adjusting her gold-framed glasses. Ah, dubida, dia. Do you still insist on this minor property issue? This space has the potential to benefit the whole community. Your selfishness is impeding the cultural progress of our neighborhood. The conflict between Laura and Douglas had begun 6 months ago, when she first spotted the large plot at the back of his property. The space, deliberately kept natural by Douglas to preserve the local fauna, became the main target of Flowers in Power, a gardening club that quickly turned into a commercial enterprise under Laura's leadership. Minor? Ms. Thompson, you built a shed on my property without permission. Douglas came down the porch steps, holding a yellow envelope. This is a court summons. Enough is enough. Laura's smile faltered for a moment, but soon regained its characteristic composure. Darling, do you really want to be known as the man who stopped the cultural progress of Briarcliff Manor? Think of all those ladies who found a purpose in our workshops. Mrs. Martinez, who overcame her depression by growing orchids. Little Jimmy Parker, who discovered his vocation for botany in our classes. Don't try to manipulate me emotionally, Douglas replied, his voice firm but tired. You can carry out all these wonderful projects in an appropriate place with the proper authorizations. Rebecca Chun, Douglas' lawyer and a resident of the neighborhood, approached the gate at that moment. Her presence, there was no coincidence. Douglas had asked her to witness yet another of Laura's invasions. Ms. Thompson, Rebecca began, her voice professional and controlled. As Mr. White's legal representative, I must inform you that your actions constitute trespassing and a violation of multiple city ordinances. The shed you build does not have a permit and poses a safety hazard. Laura straightened her posture, her smile now revealing a hint of defiance. Darling, you're too young to understand how things work around here. I have the full support of the Residents Association. Stanley Morrison, the president, fully understands the importance of our work. The HOA support is no substitute for the law, Ms. Thompson, Rebecca replied. And I must remind you that Mr. Morrison is currently under investigation for administrative irregularities. The movement on the property began to attract the attention of the neighbors. Mrs. Patel from number 47 watched discreetly from behind her lace curtains. The Richardsons, a retired couple from across the road, had interrupted their morning walk to watch the situation unfold. I have here, Douglas held up another document, a preliminary court order demanding the immediate cessation of all commercial activities on my property and the removal of the illegal shed within 48 hours. Laura paled slightly, but maintained her posture. This is ridiculous. We have an event scheduled for this weekend. 40 people have already paid for their tickets. That's not my problem, Mrs. Thompson, Douglas replied. You've had multiple opportunities to resolve this amicably. Rebecca added, I strongly recommend that you cancel the event and start planning the removal of the shed. Otherwise, you will face significant legal consequences. The sound of an approaching car interrupted the discussion. Stanley Morrison, president of the HOA, parked his silver Mercedes by the curb. Tall and imposing in his well-cut suit, he strode towards the group with the confidence of someone used to having the last word. What's the problem here? Stanley asked, positioning himself strategically next to Laura. "The problem, Mr. Morrison," Rebecca replied before anyone else could speak, "is that you and Mrs. Thompson are about to face prosecution for conspiracy to trespass. I have documents here that prove that you authorized and encouraged these illegal activities, exceeding your authority as president of the HOA." Stanley's confident smile faltered. Laura looked at him, hoping for support, but for the first time since the conflict began, her most powerful ally seemed speechless. The morning had begun like so many others in Briarcliff Manor, but it was about to mark the start of a battle that would divide the community and force its residents to question the true meaning of property, community, and power. The Briarcliff Manor Residents Association office emanated an air of artificial authority, its walls lined with framed diplomas and photos of Stanley Morrison shaking hands with local politicians. Laura Thompson nervously adjusted her watering-can brooch as Stanley paced back and forth, his Italian suit reflecting the light coming in through the panoramic windows. "We need to rethink our strategy, Laura," Stanley declared, stopping abruptly. "Rebecca Chun is not just any opponent. She's built her reputation by taking down abusive HOAs all over New York State." Laura removed her gold-rimmed glasses, methodically wiping them with a silk handkerchief. "Stanley, dear, you promised you had everything under control. We've invested a lot of money in that shed. The club has signed contracts, commitments, and do you have any idea what will happen if they find out about the other plots?" Stanley interrupted, lowering his voice. "The Richardsons, the Petersons, the late Johnson's estate, all the places where you expanded your activities?" The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Laura had, over the past 2 years, established a network of cultural centers in empty or supposedly abandoned properties throughout Briarcliff Manor. Each operation had been carefully legitimized by HOA documents signed by Stanley. "We're providing a service to the community," Laura insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "We turn dead spaces into centers of life and learning. People support us. People don't know that you're operating a profitable business on property that doesn't belong to you," Stanley retorted. "And now we have Douglas White, a respected former university professor with a lawyer specializing in property rights, digging into our past." On the other side of town, Rebecca Chun was leaning over a pile of documents in her office at Chun & Associates. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of Manhattan in the distance, but her attention was focused on the financial records of Flowers and Power. "Mason," she called her legal assistant, "I need you to cross-reference these receipts with the county property records. Something doesn't add up." Mason Parker, a young man recently graduated from law school, approached with a cup of coffee. "Have you noticed that all the workshops take place on different properties? And always on land owned by people who have recently moved away or passed away?" "Exactly," Rebecca agreed, marking points on a digital map. "Laura Thompson isn't just encroaching on Douglas's property. She's created a parallel empire, operating under the guise of cultural community development." Meanwhile, Douglas White had an unexpected visitor. Margaret Martinez, a 68-year-old woman, was standing on her balcony, holding a pot of orchids. "Mr. White," she began hesitantly, "I know we don't really know each other, but I need to tell you something about Laura Thompson and Flowers and Power." Douglas invited her in, noting how her hands trembled as she held the vase. Margaret had been mentioned by Laura as an example of the success of her program. "Mrs. Thompson, she's not just using your land," Margaret explained, sitting in the living room. "After my husband passed away last year, she showed up offering therapeutic gardening classes. She said it would be good for my grief." "Was it?" Douglas asked softly. "At first, yes, but then she started suggesting that I donate part of my yard to the program. When I refused, she mentioned that she had influence in the HOA and that there might be problems with approving the renovations I planned to do." Douglas felt his stomach turn. "Did she threaten you?" "Not directly," Margaret replied, tears in her eyes. "She has a way, always smiling, always talking about the greater good of the community. But there's something predatory about her method." Rebecca received the transcript of the conversation with Margaret a few hours later, via an authorized recording. Each new statement revealed a more complex pattern of manipulation and coercion. "Mason," she called, "I need you to prepare subpoenas for all the properties listed on this map. We're going to need statements from every owner or heir. What about the president of the HOA? Mason questioned, organizing the documents. Stanley Morrison is a smarter player, Rebecca replied, a determined smile on her face. He let Laura do the dirty work while keeping his hands apparently clean. But every empire has its weak point. That same afternoon, Laura held an emergency meeting with her gardening instructors in the shed built on Douglas's property. The atmosphere, usually fragrant with fresh flowers and aromatic herbs, was charged with tension. Our work is legitimate, she declared to her team. We will not allow bureaucrats and egoists to destroy everything we have built. The community is on our side. But while Laura was speaking, Rebecca Chan was putting together the pieces of a much bigger puzzle. Every document, every statement, every financial record revealed a web of manipulation that extended far beyond a simple dispute over a piece of land. The sun was setting on Briarcliff Manor, casting long shadows over the immaculate gardens and white picket fences. In his office, Stanley Morrison stared at a folder marked Operation Flowers, his face reflecting the weight of the decisions he would have to make in the coming hours. The battle for territory at Briarcliff Manor was about to turn into an all-out war, where Laura Thompson's carefully tended gardens could turn out to be a minefield of legal and moral consequences. The meeting room of the Chun and Associates office buzzed with activity as Rebecca methodically organized a series of panels with photos, documents, and diagrams connected by red lines. The pattern that emerged was disturbing, a web of manipulation that stretched across Briarcliff Manor. "We found something interesting," Mason said, entering the room with a pile of documents. "The Johnsons' property? It wasn't really abandoned. The family was in the process of inventorying it when Laura Thompson started her cultural activities there." Rebecca adjusted her thin-framed glasses, examining the new documents. "And let me guess, Stanley Morrison, as president of the HOA, interfered with the process in some way?" "Even better," Mason smiled, handing over a brown envelope. "We found out that Morrison is a hidden partner in 3 landscaping companies that provide exclusive services for the Flores and Poder cultural centers." Meanwhile, at the White residence, Douglas received an unexpected visit. Jennifer Patterson, a young journalist from the Briarcliff Chronicle, was sitting in his living room, her tablet ready to take notes. "Mr. White, your case against Laura Thompson caught my attention for a specific reason," Jennifer began, her green eyes shining with determination. 2 years ago, I wrote a series of investigative reports about irregularities in housing associations. They were all mysteriously shelved. Douglas leaned forward in his chair. "And you believe there's a connection?" "Stanley Morrison has influential friends at the newspaper," Jennifer replied, lowering her voice. "But now, with a formal lawsuit underway and a lawyer of Ms. Chen's caliber involved, they can no longer hush up the story." At Flores and Poder, Laura Thompson was conducting an emergency meeting with her most loyal instructors. The shed, which normally exuded tranquility with its floral arrangements and ambient music, was as tense as a violin string about to snap. "We need to come together more than ever," Laura declared, her watering can brooch sparkling under the LED lights. "Douglas White and his mercenary lawyer want to destroy everything we've built. Our community work, our cultural mission." "With all due respect, Ms. Thompson," interrupted Michael Ramirez, one of the older instructors, "but is it true that you're using workshop funds to finance your new house in Greenwich?" The silence that followed was deafening. Laura adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses, her smile faltering for a moment. "Michael, darling, I think you're confusing things. Perhaps we should discuss this in private." "There's nothing to discuss in private," a firm voice sounded from the entrance to the shed. Rebecca Chun was standing there, accompanied by 2 bailiffs. "Ms. Thompson, we have a search and seizure warrant for all of Flores and Poder's financial records." Laura paled but maintained her posture. "That's absurd. Stanley would never allow." "Mr. Morrison is too busy testifying at the district attorney's office," Rebecca replied, advancing through the shed. "Apparently, bribery of public officials and falsification of documents are federal crimes." The instructors began to disperse, many of them avoiding looking at Laura. Michael Ramirez remained, watching as the officers began to collect documents and computers. "Why, Michael?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. After everything I'd done for you. Because my mother, Elena Ramirez, lost her land for her cultural activities when she was hospitalized, he replied, removing his Flores and Poder badge. And because integrity matters. At Briarcliff Manor Town Hall, an extraordinary meeting of the town council was in progress. Jennifer Patterson had a front-row seat, streaming live from the Chronicle's website. Douglas White was testifying about years of systematic abuse by the HOA under Morrison's leadership. This is not just about my property, Douglas told the board. This is about a pattern of predatory behavior that has affected dozens of families in our community. Vulnerable people have been bullied, manipulated, and robbed under the guise of cultural development. Rebecca presented meticulously organized evidence. Suspicious bank transfers, forged permits, testimonies from aggrieved homeowners. The empire that Laura Thompson and Stanley Morrison had built was crumbling in real time. In the parking lot of City Hall, Marta Martinez met Douglas after the meeting. Mr. White, I wanted to thank you. After so long feeling powerless. Don't thank me. Douglas smiled gently. Thank Ms. Chun and Ms. Patterson. They're the real heroes of this story. The sun was setting over Briarcliff Manor, casting golden shadows over the gardens that had become battlefields in a war much bigger than property and flowers. In the office of Chun and Associates, Rebecca was examining one last set of documents. Mason, she called to her assistant, prepare subpoenas for all the financial institutions listed here. I have a hunch where all that money from the workshops really ended up. What about Mrs. Thompson? Laura Thompson built her reputation by manipulating people's kindness, Rebecca replied, looking out of the window at the city that was beginning to light up. Now she's going to learn that there's a price to pay for confusing power with entitlement. Night was falling over Briarcliff Manor, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't the silence of fear that hung over its residents, but the promise of justice and renewal. The true meaning of community was being rediscovered, not through forced gardens and manipulated events, but through the courage of ordinary people who refused to remain silent in the face of the abuse of power. The dossier on Rebecca Chen's desk was a mountain of evidence that threatened to crumble Laura Thompson's carefully constructed empire. Financial investigations revealed a complex network of offshore accounts and suspicious transactions that extended far beyond the confines of Briarcliff Manor. It's impressive, Mason commented, looking at the bank statements. Each therapeutic workshop generated an average of $5,000, multiplied by 6 different rentals for times a month. And all this tax-free under the guise of a non-profit cultural organization, Rebecca added, ticking off numbers on her spreadsheet. Laura Thompson wasn't just stealing land. She was operating a money laundering scheme. On the other side of town, Stanley Morrison was facing his own nightmare. Sitting in an interrogation room at the district attorney's office, his Italian suit no longer looked so imposing. Mr. Morrison, Assistant District Attorney James Whitaker began. We have documents here showing that your wife received regular monthly payments from a company called Green Future Investments. Curiously, this company was registered on the same day that Mrs. Thompson began operations at Briarcliff Manor. Stanley adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that didn't go unnoticed. My wife is a landscaping consultant. Her services are legitimate. Interesting, Whitaker replied, sliding another document across the table. Because according to our records, your wife was in a coma in hospital during 3 of the contracts she supposedly carried out. Meanwhile, at the Briarcliff Chronicle, Jennifer Patterson was working furiously on her lead article. Her investigations had found that Laura Thompson's scheme extended to 3 other counties, always following the same pattern: identifying vulnerable properties, manipulating documents through corrupt HOAs, and establishing cultural centers that were, in fact, money laundering machines. Ms. Patterson, a tremulous voice, interrupted her concentration. It was Alice Johnson, granddaughter of the late owners of one of the raided properties. I brought something you need to see. Alice removed a set of old letters from her handbag. I found these in the attic of my grandparents' house. They're veiled threats from Mrs. Thompson, dating back to before they passed away. She was pressuring them to donate the land even when my grandmother was undergoing cancer treatment. At Douglas White's property, a small crowd gathered. Bailiffs supervised the demolition of the illegal shed, while local residents looked on, many of them former victims of Laura's scam. "It's hard to believe we fell for this," Marta Martinez commented, standing next to Douglas. "She seems so dedicated to the community, so concerned about our welfare. The most efficient predators are those who know how to camouflage themselves," Douglas replied, watching the walls of the shed crumble. Laura Thompson turned kindness into a weapon. In the office of Chun and Associates, Rebecca was receiving an important call. "Yes, Governor. I understand completely. No, sir, this won't just affect Briarcliff Manor. We're talking about a statewide operation." After hanging up, she turned to Mason. "The governor's office is concerned. Apparently, Laura Thompson has connections to several state politicians. She used flowers and power to make substantial campaign donations. Money laundered through therapeutic gardening." Mason shook his head in disbelief. Who would have thought? Laura Thompson, meanwhile, was entrenched in her newly built mansion in Greenwich, surrounded by expensive lawyers and piles of documents they were desperately trying to turn into a coherent defense. "You can't prove anything," she insisted, her watering-can brooch still unblemished on her blazer. "Everything I did was for the good of the community." Ms. Thompson, her lead attorney, interrupted. "They have evidence that you forced 6 seniors to sign property transfer documents. That's criminal coercion." The flower empire was crumbling, petal by petal. At Briarcliff Manor, Rebecca Chun was coordinating a special task force to identify and contact all the victims of the scam. Jennifer Patterson published a series of explosive reports that revealed the true nature of flowers and power. "It's like a cancer," Douglas commented during a meeting with Rebecca. "It started small within a legal shed on my land, but it grew until it infected the whole community. Sometimes you have to pull up a plant by the roots to save the garden," Rebecca replied, organizing more documents for the next phase of the process. "The real challenge now will be to recover the properties and restore the community's trust." The fall of Laura Thompson's empire revealed a painful truth about how power and manipulation can hide behind the most benign of facades. At Briarcliff Manor, residents were beginning to rebuild not only their estates, but also their sense of community, this time based on more solid foundations than stolen flowers and forced gardens. The sun was setting over the rubble of the last flowers and power shed, marking the end of an era of manipulation and the beginning of a new spring for Briarcliff Manor. A spring where each flower would grow in its own time, in its own soil, nourished not by greed, but by the true essence of community. The cold morning light illuminated the Westchester County courtroom as Laura Thompson, once an imposing figure at Briarcliff Manor, took the stand. Her moss-green blazer, once a symbol of authority, now looked faded under the fluorescent lights. His trademark watering-can brooch was conspicuously absent. Rebecca Chun was organizing her notes on the prosecution table, each document representing a piece of the elaborate scheme that had finally come to light. Next to her, Jennifer Patterson of the Briarcliff Chronicle was discreetly taking notes, her tablet recording every historic moment of that trial that had captured the attention of the entire state of New York. "Your Honor," Rebecca began, her clear, firm voice echoing through the room, "what we have here is not just a trespassing case. We will be presenting evidence of a systematic criminal operation that spanned 3 counties, victimizing dozens of vulnerable homeowners." Judge Marcus Hawthorne, known for his strict stance in property fraud cases, adjusted his glasses as he examined the first set of evidence. In the gallery, Douglas White looked on alongside Marta Martinez and other Briarcliff Manor residents who had been affected by the Flores and Poder scam. Stanley Morrison, now wearing an orange state penitentiary jumpsuit, was brought in to testify as part of his plea bargain. His testimony revealed the astonishing extent of the operation. "Ms. Thompson developed the plan in 2019, Morrison declared, avoiding his former partner's furious stare. "It started as a simple gardening operation, but when we realized the financial potential of using underutilized properties, we expanded quickly." Rebecca projected a digital map showing the network of affected properties. "Mr. Morrison, could you explain how Ms. Thompson selected her targets?" "She monitored local obituaries, hospital records through contacts in the medical field," Morrison replied, his voice trembling slightly. "She looked for vulnerable homeowners, sick elderly people, grieving families, hospitalized people. Then I use flowers and power to establish an initial presence, always under the guise of cultural development. In the gallery, Alice Johnson held her mother's hand as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. The threatening letters sent to her grandparents were now part of the evidence, revealing the calculated cruelty behind Laura's benevolent smile. Michael Ramirez, the former Flores and Poder instructor, was the next witness. His detailed testimony about the inner workings of the scheme provoked shocked whispers around the courtroom. Each workshop was carefully designed to look legitimate, Michael explained. We had qualified instructors, quality materials, even partnerships with local florists. But behind it was an elaborate system of money laundering and land grabbing. Rebecca presented financial documents showing how the money flowed through a network of shell companies before ending up in offshore accounts controlled by Laura Thompson. The mansion in Greenwich, the luxury cars, the international trips, all financed with money extracted from vulnerable landlords and overpriced workshops. Ms. Thompson, District Attorney Arthur Reynolds questioned during cross-examination. How do you explain the fact that your nonprofit organization has generated over $12 million in undeclared profits in the last 3 years? Laura Thompson, for the first time since the trial began, seemed to lose her characteristic composure. I was providing an essential service to the community, transforming abandoned spaces into centers of culture and learning. Abandoned spaces? Reynolds repeated, his voice laden with irony. Like the Johnson property, where you started building a cultural center while Mrs. Johnson was still undergoing cancer treatment? Or Mrs. Ramirez's property, which you invaded while she was hospitalized? At the defense table, Laura's expensive lawyers looked increasingly uncomfortable. The evidence was overwhelming, and each new piece of testimony only solidified the prosecution's case. Jennifer Patterson, watching from the back of the room, typed furiously on her tablet. Her series of reports on the case had already earned her a nomination for a Pulitzer Prize, exposing not only Laura Thompson's scheme, but also a wider network of corruption in neighborhood associations across the state. After 6 days of testimony and arguments, the jury took just 4 hours to reach a verdict. When the jury foreman stood up, the silence in the room was palpable. On all 47 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion, we find the defendant, Laura Thompson, guilty. Judge Hawthorne's gavel echoed through the room, sealing the fate of the flower empire built on lies and manipulation. The sentence: 25 years in prison, full restitution to the victims, and the permanent dissolution of Flowers and Power. In the corridor of the courthouse after the verdict, Rebecca found Douglas White talking to Martyr Martinez and other ex-members of the community. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice laden with hope and apprehension. "Now," Rebecca replied with a gentle smile, "we begin the healing process. Every property will be returned to its rightful owners, and we're setting up an assistance fund to help restore the affected land." Douglas looked out the courthouse window at the white plain skyline. "You know," he reflected, "sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow after we've removed the weeds." Jennifer Patterson, finishing her notes, captured that final moment for her report. The fall of Laura Thompson's empire was not just a story of crime and punishment, but a powerful reminder of the importance of protecting the vulnerable and preserving true community values. At Briarcliff Manor, the gardens would begin to flourish again, this time nurtured not by greed and manipulation, but by the genuine spirit of community that Laura Thompson had tried so hard to forge. Justice, like the hardiest of flowers, had found a way to sprout through the cracks in the concrete of corruption.